The fluorescent lights hummed against polished tile as Brooke Sullivan moved through Colorado Springs Seattle General ICU at 0600, her gait betraying a slight limp from shrapnel still lodged in her left femur. She carried a folded flag in her jacket pocket, teammate Marco Rodriguez, KIA Hindu Kush, touching it twice every shift like a talisman. The antiseptic smell of the corridor was a language she'd learned to speak fluently, though her hands remembered other smells. Gunpowder. Desert dust. Blood on canvas stretchers in forward operating bases where the triage was faster and the mercy quieter. Room 347 held Colonel James Hendricks, her patient for the past 3 weeks. He was 71, decorated, deteriorating, and no one in this hospital knew the real reason she'd transferred to Seattle General's critical care unit with a spotless vocational nursing credential and a fabricated work history dating back 7 years. Colonel Hendricks was her son's commanding officer from the Hindu Kush, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, and she'd taken this assignment on classified Air Force orders to monitor his condition and investigate something far darker than anyone in this building understood. A drug diversion ring with defense contractor ties. Missing medications. Altered records. 3,000 pills unaccounted for in the past 18 months. She checked his chart without looking at his face. The ritual mattered. Looking at him meant remembering Danny's voice on leave, the way he'd said, "The colonel saved my entire unit." Looking at him meant thinking about what would happen if she failed. Brooke's hands moved with the muscle memory of survival. For line check. Ventilator hum. Heart monitor steady at 72. O2 sat 96% on for liters nasal cannula. Everything stable. Everything normal. Everything a lie, because Colonel Hendricks was dying from something no CT scan and no blood work could find, and she was the only person in this hospital who knew exactly what to look for, though she couldn't tell them, and they wouldn't believe her if she did. The unit smelled like linen spray and the particular staleness of air that never quite left the building. She moved past the nurses' station at 0700, keeping her head down the way vocational nurses were trained to do, which was to say, the way women who didn't belong were trained to disappear. 2 RNs glanced at her without registering her presence. Good. The limp helped. The deferential posture helped. The way she asked permission before entering a room helped. Dr. Mercer is doing grand rounds, the charge nurse called out. ICU patients. Conference room A. You should observe. It wasn't a suggestion. Brooke nodded and moved toward the conference room, her tactical awareness noting exits, noting which nurses carried what passwords, noting the pharmaceutical supply station lock code someone had written on a post-it note under a desk calendar. The habit of observation had kept her alive for 12 years. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. It wasn't going to stop now. The conference room was where hierarchy made itself visible. 12 attending physicians ringed a table covered with patient charts, imaging studies, lab reports. Dr. Marcus Mercer stood at the center like a conductor before an orchestra, salt and pepper hair that cost $200 to cut, cufflinks engraved with his initials, the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned. She'd learned to read men like him. The kind who built entire identities on the fact that other people didn't dare contradict them. He saw her enter and his expression shifted into something that resembled a smile, the way a predator's mouth moves just before the kill. "Ah," he said, holding up Colonel Hendricks' chart. "Gentlemen, let me show you what happens when we allow vocational nurses to assume they understand complex cases." The room went quiet. 12 physicians turned to look at the chart he was holding. 12 physicians who didn't know she could read their faces like a tactical map of who was weak and who was competent and who could be turned if it came to that. She stood against the wall with the other nursing staff, watching Mercer dissect her documentation with theatrical disgust. "The assessment here is incomplete," he said, flipping pages. "The intervention notes suggest a level of clinical judgment I would question. And the discharge recommendations," he paused. His smile widened. "Well, this is not the work of someone who understands the nuances of critical care management." One of the younger physicians shifted in his seat. The cardiologist was taking notes. None of them looked at Brooke. That was the point. She didn't exist in this room except as a cautionary tale. In future, Mercer continued, I'll be reviewing all patient documentation from vocational staff before it enters the medical record. We cannot have this standard of care reflected in the chart. It's frankly embarrassing. Brooke didn't move. Her face didn't change. Her heart rate remained steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the specific kind of control that came from having already lived through worse, from having held a dying Marine's hand while shrapnel tore through his abdomen, from having made triage decisions that meant someone went home and someone didn't. This moment with Mercer was so small it was almost invisible. The grand rounds continued for another 20 minutes. At no point did anyone acknowledge she was in the room. At no point did she acknowledge that she'd heard every word. This was how power worked in places like hospitals. You could destroy someone's professional credibility while they stood 3 feet away and they had to keep their expression flat. You could imply incompetence and negligence and they had to accept it without defense. When the doctors filed out, Brooke remained still for exactly 7 seconds before moving toward the door. That timing was deliberate. It looked like she was giving them space. It actually prevented casual conversation that might lead to follow-up insults. The vending machine in the basement corridor was her destination. It was also where Mercer was waiting, his suit jacket slung over one arm, a coffee in his hand with a cost that probably exceeded her hourly wage. He stood between her and the machine with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never once considered that someone might push back. Those shoes are held together with athletic tape, he observed. Not a question. A statement designed to wound. There are several clinics in Colorado Springs that would be more comfortable for you. Places where the pace is slower. Where patients don't require the level of oversight that a major medical center demands. Urgent care clinics. Places where the other girls who couldn't hack medical school end up doing just fine. The words hung in the air like shrapnel waiting to detonate. Brooke looked at him. Directly. Eye to eye. Her jaw tightened. Her breathing remained even. Strange, she said. Her voice had the quality of winter ice. The Colonel trusts me at his bedside more than any physician on this floor. She walked past him before he could respond. His face reddened. She heard him exhale sharply, the sound a man made when someone had just reminded him that he didn't have the access he thought he had. She didn't look back. The vending machine dispensed black coffee. She paid 75 cents and pocketed the change. The coffee was bitter, which was exactly what she needed. She stood in the empty corridor with the fluorescent lights humming their constant, horrible hymn, and touched the folded flag in her jacket pocket. Marco Rodriguez had been 24. He'd been from Albuquerque. He'd written letters home that he never sent. What no one in this hospital knew was the architecture of her actual life. Not Brooke Sullivan, RN, vocational nurse with a spotless credential and a fake work history. Captain Brooke Sullivan, Air Force Intelligence, placed at Seattle General on direct orders from JSOC to monitor a colonel whose medical deterioration was following a pattern that suggested poisoning. Not by a person. By something systematic. By someone with access to his medications and the knowledge to introduce substances that wouldn't show up on standard toxicology screens. By someone inside this hospital. Mercer's resentment of her made perfect sense now. He didn't hate her because she was a vocational nurse without medical credentials. He hated her because she had the colonel's ear and his trust without the MD degree that Mercer had spent decades acquiring, and that offense against the natural hierarchy of authority was something he couldn't tolerate. But there was something else underneath that, something darker. The way he'd focused on the colonel specifically during rounds. The way his questions had been designed to undermine Brooke's credibility with the medical team, which meant undermining the colonel's trust in her assessments, which meant isolating him. She didn't know yet if Mercer was part of the diversion ring. That investigation was above her clearance. But she knew how to recognize when someone was trying to remove a witness from a room. And that's exactly what he was doing. Brooke drank her coffee in silence. The folded flag was still heavy in her pocket. She had work to do, and none of it involved playing a vocational nurse anymore. Not when the person who'd spent his life leading her son's unit was running out of time. The monitors screamed at 2:33 a.m., and Brooke Sullivan moved without hesitation toward room 347 like someone who had already lived this moment 1,000 times in the Hindu Kush. Colonel James Hendricks lay grey against white pillows, his breathing shallow and rapid, each inhalation a visible effort that shouldn't have been this labored. She'd seen that progression before. She knew exactly what was happening inside his chest. Tension pneumothorax evolving into hemorrhagic shock. Thoracic bleed. The kind of emergency that kills in minutes if no one intervenes. She paged cardiothoracic surgery stat, her voice steady and professional. Dr. Chen arrived within 4 minutes, examined the colonel with a practiced hand, checked his phone for exactly 30 seconds, then announced the patient was stable enough for morning imaging and left without meeting her eyes. Brooke called pulmonology. Dr. Ramirez came, listened to the muffled heart sounds, then claimed the border patient wasn't his service line and disappeared down the corridor. She tried interventional radiology, general surgery, trauma. By midnight she'd reached 12 different physicians at Seattle General, and all 12 had refused the case. Each one found a reason. Each one had somewhere else to be. The pattern was unmistakable. Surgical precision in its own way. During her break, she stood in the stairwell between the 3rd and 4th floors and heard 2 residents talking below. Their voices carried upward like smoke. Mercer spent the whole afternoon making calls, one of them said. Told everyone Hendricks has a litigious family. Massive lawsuit history. Not worth the professional risk. The other resident laughed. Mercer's doing everyone a favor by warning them. The voices faded as they descended, and Brooke stood motionless on the landing with her hand on the cold metal railing. She understood now what Mercer had done. He hadn't just publicly humiliated her at grand rounds. He hadn't just cornered her at the vending machine with his breath and his condescension. He had spent his day systematically poisoning the well, making phone calls to every physician on the medical staff, framing Colonel Hendricks as untouchable. A legal liability wrapped in a patient chart. A man no doctor wanted anywhere near their credentials. Mercer had weaponized institutional hierarchy itself. When she returned to room 347, the colonel's pressure had dropped to 60 systolic. His skin was the color of old concrete. She watched the monitors as his oxygen saturation slipped from 89 to 84 to 79, watched his heart rate climb above 140 as his body screamed for blood it didn't have. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm beside him, pumping air into lungs that couldn't distribute it anymore. One of his eyes opened, just barely, and found hers across the darkened room. "Your son," he whispered, each word an effort. "Good soldier. Hindu Kush." She leaned closer. "Colonel. Tell him." His pressure dropped another 5 points. His words became fragments. "Tell him I, proud." The monitors screamed. Blood pressure 58. Oxygen saturation 76. Heart rate 148. Sinus rhythm fragmenting into irregular beats that meant his heart was drowning in its own chamber. She hit the code button. The response team arrived in exactly 90 seconds, 3 residents, 2 nurses, a respiratory tech. They assembled around the bed with the choreography of people who had done this 1,000 times. They assembled with the understanding that a physician would follow, that someone with an MD credential would arrive within moments to make the decisions that mattered. No one came. Brooke waited. She waited through the first round of medication pushes, the epinephrine, the atropine. She waited while the residents looked at each other with the panic of people who realized they were alone. The attending physician on call was Dr. Mercer. When she paged him, his response came back through the nursing station speaker, his voice calm and professorial. "Continue resuscitation efforts per protocol. I'll review the chart in the morning." The chart in the morning. The colonel would be dead by morning. One of the residents, a young man named Torres, looked at Brooke with eyes that asked the question his position wouldn't let him speak. "What do we do?" She could see him calculating, see the mathematics of his career playing across his face. Getting aggressive with this case meant going against the senior physicians who had already declined. It meant career suicide, just like Mercer had spent all day implying. Brooke made her choice in that moment. She made it the way she had made choices in the Hindu Kush when protocols had become obstacles and soldiers had stopped breathing. She made it the way Captain Sullivan made choices when there was no one left to decide but herself. "Everyone step back," she said. The tone of her voice, something had shifted in it. Something dropped an octave and became a command instead of a request. Torres and the other residents moved without questioning, muscle memory responding to an authority they couldn't quite place. The nurses stepped back. The respiratory tech stepped back. She opened her locker in the break room, and her hands moved with their own memory toward the interior back corner where she had taped the combat knife inside a plastic sheath 8 months ago when she accepted this assignment. Sterilization with betadine. The knife was surgical grade, the blade still sharp enough that it gleamed under the fluorescent lights. She had kept it for exactly this scenario, the scenario that would end her cover, blow her mission, potentially destroy everything the Pentagon had placed her here to do. She walked back to room 347 and laid the knife on the sterile field beside the colonel's bed. "What is that?" one of the residents whispered, his voice small. "Emergency thoracotomy," Brooke said. Her hands moved on their own now, muscle memory taking over in a way that made her voice steady and clinical. "Left anterolateral approach. Someone get me a 14-gauge angiocath needle and a 3.5 endotracheal tube. Scalpel, forceps, and a satin sky clamp if you can find it in the next 45 seconds. Torres moved immediately, the kind of movement that came from recognizing a superior officer who knew exactly what she was doing. Her hands prepped the surgical site with practiced efficiency, the betadine spreading across the colonel's exposed chest wall in broad strokes that left temporary amber stains on his skin. The knife was balanced, weighted perfectly, its handle familiar against her palm in a way that said hospital emergency and not really the first emergency she'd ever had to handle with a blade. She made the incision. The tissue parted with almost no resistance, muscle and fascia spreading open to reveal the architecture of the chest cavity. There was the rib cage, there was the space between the ribs where she needed to go. She could hear her own breathing, steady and controlled, could hear the monitors screaming behind her, could hear Torres returning with equipment he didn't know she might need because he wasn't questioning anymore, he was obeying. She worked through the internal intercostal muscles with the blade, working carefully to avoid the intercostal artery, working with the precision that came from having done this in dusty medical tents where the electricity was unreliable and the alternatives to success were unacceptable. The heart. There it was, the muscular organ moving weakly, drowning in its own space. She could see the source of the bleed now, see where the fractured rib had torn through tissue and created a cavity filling with blood. Her hands moved the satin sky clamp into position, isolating the bleeding vessel with the same calm she used to check medications. 2 minutes. 3 minutes. The sound of her own breathing, steady as a metronome. The hiss of the ventilator. The fading beep of the monitor as the colonel's heart began responding to oxygenation again, the color returning to his skin in slow increments that meant maybe, just maybe, he was going to survive this. That was when Dr. Mercer walked into room 347. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame, and his face cycled through expressions like a man watching a film of his own destruction play in real time. Incredulity. Rage. Something that looked almost like fear. He saw Brooke wrist deep in Colonel Hendricks' chest cavity, saw the combat knife on the sterile field, saw the residents and nurses standing frozen with the understanding that they had just witnessed something that violated every protocol in the hospital's policies. He saw a vocational nurse, a woman he had spent weeks dismissing as inadequate, performing a surgical procedure that only attending physicians were trained to do. He saw his hierarchy crumble. The room went dead silent except for the ventilator wheeze and the monitor's steady beep. The colonel's oxygen saturation climbed. 84, 88. 91, his heart rate stabilized. His skin color shifted from gray toward something that suggested a man still tethered to life. Brooke continued working, her focus absolute, her hands moving through the final steps of the procedure with the muscle memory of someone who had done this when the alternative was watching soldiers die in the dark. She closed the chest with the same precision. Sutures. Sterile dressing. The blade placed carefully on a tray. Sinus rhythm, she said. Her voice had become something else entirely now. Something that carried the weight of rank and experience. Stable vitals. Get into OR for proper closure and imaging. Someone notify cardiothoracic and trauma surgery that the patient is now their responsibility. Dr. Mercer was still standing in the doorway. Torres looked at Brooke, then at Mercer, then back at Brooke. He moved toward the doctor with the chart, his body language having shifted into something new. She had given him permission with that voice. She had given him an order he couldn't refuse, even though he didn't understand why he couldn't. Mercer's face had gone from red to something closer to white. Mercer's hand was still on her shoulder when the colonel's oxygen saturation climbed to 92%. The intercostal artery was tied off with a precision knot that would have made a vascular surgeon nod in recognition. Brooke didn't look at him. She didn't acknowledge the rage radiating off him like heat off summer concrete. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. "What in God's name are you doing?" Mercer's voice cracked on the last word, a sound like ice breaking under pressure. She turned the retractor another quarter inch. The bleeding stopped completely. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. The colonel's blood pressure climbed from 70 systolic to 88. She could feel his heart beating against her palm now, strong, regular, alive. "Saving his life, doctor," she said quietly. Not a request. A statement of fact. Mercer's grip tightened on her shoulder. She felt his fingers dig in, searching for bone, for some physical leverage over a woman who had already made it clear that hierarchy didn't matter here. Not anymore. His phone was in his other hand before she finished the sentence. "Security. Room 347. Immediately." His voice was clipped, military precision bleeding through his rage. He'd learned somewhere how to command when his authority was slipping. It didn't help him. Brooke sutured the thoracotomy closed with practiced efficiency. Every stitch was a period at the end of a sentence she wasn't allowed to write. The two residents who had frozen at the bedside, a first-year resident named Chen and a medical student whose name she'd never learned, stood motionless against the far wall, their eyes tracking every movement like they were witnessing something that would either save their careers or destroy them, depending on which way this landed. It was landing on both of them, Brooke realized. The residents would be fine. The system would protect them. They had MD degrees pending. They had futures that didn't include a folded flag in a jacket pocket. The security guards arrived in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. She knew because she could read the wall clock. Time had become very precise in her line of work. Precision was all that kept you alive in the mountains when the dust kicked up and the radio chatter turned to gunfire. Mercer pointed at her like she was a specimen under glass. This woman just performed surgery with a knife. A knife. Not authorized. Not credentialed. Remove her from patient care areas immediately. The guards looked at Brooke. They looked at the surgeon's field in front of them, the closed thoracotomy, the stable colonel, the two residents still frozen against the wall like paintings in a gallery of guilt. They looked at Dr. Mercer, whose face had gone from red to a shade of white that didn't occur in nature. The taller guard, name tag reading Holloway, kept his voice flat. Professional. He'd seen emergency procedures before, probably. Seattle General had a level 1 trauma center. He'd learned to recognize desperate medicine. Brooke turned to the sink and began washing her hands. The water was hot. Soap bubbles rose and disappeared like breath. She could smell the antiseptic, that acrid, institutional smell that said sterile, said clean, said safe. Everything about this moment was the opposite of safe. "I'm finished here," she said. She dried her hands on a paper towel. White rough, the kind that institutional bathrooms provided. Everything in hospitals was designed for efficiency and forgetting. This towel would be thrown away. Her badge would be scanned out of the system. Her shift would be marked as terminated. In 48 hours, there would be no record that Captain Brooke Sullivan had ever walked these corridors. The badge hung from a retractable reel clipped to her waistband. Blue, with her photo from 3 months ago, a woman with dyed brown hair and tired eyes who was supposed to be nobody. She unclipped it and held it out to Mercer, not to the guards. He stared at it like it was a grenade with the pin pulled. I said remove her, he repeated to Holloway, but his eyes never left the badge. Brooke stepped toward Mercer instead of away. Close enough that he could smell her antiseptic sweat, the faint metallic tang of blood under her fingernails despite the washing. Close enough that he had to take a step back, which meant he stepped on Holloway's foot, which meant the guard had to shift his weight, which meant the entire dynamic in the room tilted. She placed the badge in Mercer's hand. It was a choice, not a surrender. There was a difference, and she needed him to know it. The badge was just plastic and laminate. What she was handing him was permission to think he'd won. "My apologies, Doctor," she said. The deferential voice was still in there, underneath everything else. She could summon it when she needed to. It was a tool, like the knife had been a tool. Like the thoracotomy had been a tool. Like this entire hospital had been a tool for an investigation that now felt very far away from the fact of a colonel with a stable heartbeat and a future. Mercer stared at the badge in his palm for 3 seconds. Then he turned to Holloway. "Escort her to the parking garage security desk. She's reassigned, effective immediately. No patient contact. No clinical areas. She monitors parking lot surveillance until I arrange her termination." He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. The walk to the parking garage took 6 minutes. Holloway didn't speak. The fluorescent lights flickered in their casings like insects trapped in amber. Down the main corridor where she'd walked 100 times. Past the break room where she'd memorized the location of every vending machine and the schedule of the nursing staff. Past the radiology department where she'd overheard conversations about 3 different opioid diversion schemes, all of them connected to the same supplier, all of them tied to a defense contractor with contracts worth $847 million annually. She'd been here to untangle that thread. To sit in the employee lounge and listen. To chart vital signs and watch medication counts and smile the smile of someone who didn't know anything. The parking garage smelled like concrete and exhaust and the slow decay of rubber. The security office was a converted utility closet with a bank of monitors showing angles of asphalt and parked cars and the loading dock where deliveries arrived at 5 a.m. A man named Torres sat at the desk. He'd seen her maybe 3 times in 3 months. He looked up when Holloway escorted her in. "Mercer's orders," Holloway said. "She's parking garage detail now. No hospital access." Torres nodded. Torres didn't ask questions. Torres had a pension that he was counting down to. Torres understood that some fights weren't his to fight. He pointed to a chair. "Shift starts at 6 a.m. You'll monitor the bay doors, the stairwells, camera 7 on the south lot. Anyone tries to skip payment at the gate, you call the main security line." Brooke sat in the chair. It was vinyl, cracked, held together with duct tape. This was where the hospital put people who weren't supposed to exist. She didn't correct Torres. Didn't explain that she'd be done before 6 a.m. Didn't mention that the shift was irrelevant because Mercer wasn't finished. He was competent enough to understand that removing her from the hospital was only the first move. The second move would be institutional. Her phone had started ringing at 11:44 p.m. 3 different calls. 3 different area codes. The Colorado Board of Nursing. The State Medical Board's Investigation Unit. A legal filing service processing a formal complaint. Mercer had spent the last 4 hours and 13 minutes making phone calls to every authority that could theoretically investigate her credentials. She listened to the voicemails on her way out of the hospital. His voice came through each time, smooth and professional and loaded with concern about a nurse who had been observed performing surgical procedures without authorization, without credentials, without supervision. Questions about her background. Requests for her full employment history. Allegations of practicing medicine without a license. It was competent work. He'd destroyed her professional identity in under 5 hours. The badge had been a courtesy. She'd already stopped existing the moment she pulled that knife. The diner was 2 blocks from Seattle General. Sullivan's Diner, the sign said, which meant someone had a sense of irony or a sense of fate. She didn't have the energy to figure out which. The place was empty at 2:11 a.m. Empty except for a cook who didn't look up from the grill and a waitress who was too tired to make conversation. Brooke ordered coffee. Black. The cup was chipped on the rim. The coffee was the color of motor oil and tasted like burned regret. She sat in a booth by the window and stared at her reflection in the black liquid. The flag was still in her jacket pocket, folded into that precise military triangle. Corners sharp enough to cut. She could feel the weight of it against her ribs. Marco Rodriguez had been Air Force, too. Captain Rodriguez. They'd flown out of forward operating base Shank together, same rotation. He'd been shot twice and kept walking. Sepsis got him in the end. Infection in a wound that should have been treated at a real hospital but wasn't, because there wasn't one. Just field medics and prayer and the knowledge that some battles you lost alone. The flag had come in a box. She'd kept it because throwing it away felt like a betrayal of the entire concept of keeping things. Keeping secrets. Keeping cover. Keeping your head down while 12 doctors decided that one man's life wasn't worth the liability. She lifted the coffee cup to her lips. It was cold now. The heat had evaporated along with everything else. She'd come to Seattle General to investigate a drug diversion ring, and instead she'd watched her entire professional identity dissolve in the time it took to tie off an artery. The mission was still active. The investigation was still open. The supplier was still moving product through the hospital system, probably even now, probably in rooms she wouldn't be allowed to enter anymore. Mercer had done her a favor, actually. He'd severed her from the hospital in a way that would make her useful to intelligence again. An asset with no institutional ties. An officer who could move in other directions. She should have felt relief. She should have felt clarity about the next steps. Instead, she felt the weight of the flag and the cold coffee and the knowledge that Marco had come home in a box, and Colonel Hendricks was alive because she'd made a choice that had cost her everything. That wasn't part of the mission briefing. That wasn't in any tactical scenario. That was the part they didn't teach you about being quiet in a room full of people who had no idea what quiet actually meant. The next morning arrived like a tactical incursion, quiet, precise, and unstoppable. Brooke stood in the ambulance bay entrance wearing a security guard uniform that felt like a skin that didn't belong to her, the polyester scratching against the trauma shears still clipped to her pocket from yesterday. The parking garage assignment was meant to be humiliation. It was also meant to be invisible. She was supposed to fade into the infrastructure, become part of the building's plumbing rather than its bloodstream. That was the plan until the convoy rolled in at 08 for 7. 3 hums, unmarked, tires still wet from a morning that hadn't existed in Colorado Springs. 2 armed personnel jumped from the trailing vehicle before the ambulance doors opened. They moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, weapons held low but ready, eyes scanning the ambulance bay like they were clearing a compound in Kandahar instead of a hospital parking lot in the American interior. The rotor sound from a transport that had landed on the helipad 20 minutes prior still hung in the air like an echo that hadn't finished its sentence. Brooke didn't move. She monitored the bay entrance cameras from her security booth, the screens showing what the rest of Seattle General wouldn't understand for another 30 minutes. The patient they carried was a tall man with a thick black beard matted with dried blood, his right shoulder bandaged with field dressing that had been applied by people who knew what they were doing. Gunshot wounds. Fresh ones. The tactical team moved him with the efficiency of people who'd done this on forward operating bases in the Paktia province, not in hospital hallways. The security supervisor radioed her at 08 for 9. Sullivan. Check the ambulance bay entrance. Make sure the convoy cleared properly. His voice was static, thin and indifferent. He had no idea what was rolling toward her. She walked through the back corridor, past the staff break room where 3 nurses sat drinking coffee and avoiding conversation about the vocational nurse who'd been reassigned to parking security for performing unauthorized procedures. Her footsteps echoed on the polished concrete, a sound like boots on tile, measured and deliberate. The ambulance bay doors slid open. That was when she saw his face. Khalid Nazari. Former Taliban commander, now CIA asset, now trauma patient bleeding out on a military gurney at 0851 on a Tuesday morning in Colorado Springs. She knew that face from an interrogation room in a compound outside Kabul, 3 years and 4 months ago, when she was still Captain Brooke Sullivan of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment and not a vocational nurse with a folded flag hidden in her car. His eyes found hers across the hallway. Recognition flickered like a match striking in darkness. His lips moved. One word. Quiet enough that only she heard it, the kind of whisper that carries weight instead of sound, Valkyrie. They wheeled him past. His voice came again, louder this time, cutting through the mechanical rhythm of the gurney wheels and the urgent radio chatter of the armed personnel, Valkyrie. A Marine Corps liaison officer escorting the patient convoy stopped cold. Not a physical stop, that would have been normal. This was the kind of stop that happens when someone's brain processes information that doesn't fit the architecture of what they thought they understood. He turned. His eyes locked on Brooke. Then, with the precision of someone who'd been trained to act on incomplete intelligence, he reached for the secure phone clip to his belt. Dr. Mercer appeared in the corridor like he'd been summoned by the disturbance in his personal hierarchy. His white coat was pristine, his face already reddening with the certainty that someone had violated his authority. "This is a secure patient," he said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional power. "This woman is not authorized to be in this area." The Marine ignored him completely. Not dismissively, that would have required acknowledgement. He simply turned his back on Mercer and spoke into his phone with the clipped precision of military communications. "I need authentication on callsign Valkyrie. Female, approximately 38 years old, Seattle General, Colorado Springs, currently identified as security personnel." Mercer's face hardened. "That patient is under my care, and if you continue to disrupt..." "Stand by," the Marine said, his eyes still on Brooke. He pulled a tablet from his cargo pocket, tapped it with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent more time with secure military databases than with civilian protocols. His expression transformed. Confusion became shock, shock became something that looked like recognition of how badly he'd misunderstood the landscape around him. The hallway began to fill. A resident. 2 nurses. An orderly. Word traveled at the speed of human curiosity, and human curiosity moved faster than Mercer's authority. They gathered like witnesses to something they didn't understand but sensed was consequential. "Captain Brooke Sullivan," the Marine said, his voice carrying across the growing crowd. He was reading from the tablet now, each word landing with the weight of classified information made public. "United States Air Force." Mercer stepped forward. "That's absurd. She's a vocational nurse. I've reviewed her credentials personally, and there is absolutely no military." "Silver Star Favela," the Marine continued, his voice cutting through Mercer's denial like a blade through resistance. "Purple Heart. Combat Medical Badge." A nurse gasped. Someone whispered something. Mercer's face cycled from red to a shade that looked like the color of control beginning to fracture. The Marine's eye scanned the tablet. His voice became steady, formal, the tone of someone reading into a record that would become part of permanent history. Citation reads, "For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in the Hindu Kush Mountains, while serving as flight surgeon attached to Special Operations Forces, Captain Sullivan performed emergency surgical procedures under direct enemy fire, saving 7 critically wounded soldiers when no evacuation was possible." The hallway went the kind of silent that only happens when institutional certainty dies in real time. Brooke stood motionless in her security guard uniform, her expression unchanged. That same flat stare. That same composure that had driven Mercer to madness over the past 72 hours. Except now the composure wasn't submission. It was authority held in reserve. That's... Mercer's voice had lost its edge. Someone made a mistake. I need to see documentation. Official documentation. This is clearly... The hospital administrator appeared, drawn by the gravitational pull of something that had just fundamentally altered the mass distribution in her building. She stared at the Marine, then at Brooke, then at the tablet he was holding. The Marine continued reading, multiple combat deployments, forward operating base trauma surgeon, 18 months embedded with Joint Special Operations Command Task Force Authority. His finger moved across the screen. The tablet chimed with incoming encrypted notification. General Hawthorne is inbound, he said. ETA 12 minutes. The words hung in the air like a physical thing. A general. Coming here. To this hospital. Because of something that had happened in a parking garage security booth and a hallway outside an ambulance bay. The assembled staff seemed to collectively process the fact that their afternoon had just become incomprehensibly larger. Mercer tried to reclaim authority, the way a drowning man tries to grab water. This doesn't change the fact that she performed unauthorized surgical procedures with a weapon. The elevator doors opened. 2 men in charcoal suits emerged, the kind of suits that meant Pentagon, which meant something worse than military. The first one spoke with the calm certainty of someone who'd been trained to deliver information that would reconstruct other people's understanding of reality, codename Valkyrie. Captain Sullivan's nursing position at this facility is part of an active Air Force intelligence operation investigating pharmaceutical diversion with suspected ties to defense contractor fraud. The administrator's face went the white of someone whose hospital had just become something other than a place where sick people came to heal. Mercer stepped backward, his eyes darting toward the elevator, toward the exit, toward Brooke, searching for some exit route from the moment that was consuming him. Drug diversion, he said. His voice had become something smaller than authority. Here? I would know. I'm chief of medicine. I would. We're aware of your position, Dr. Mercer. The intelligence officer's voice had the texture of someone reading from a file with your name at the top. We've been monitoring communications throughout this facility for the past 60 days. The second officer opened a folder. Inside were printouts. Dates. Phone records. A photograph of Mercer meeting with someone in a parking garage outside a pharmaceutical distribution center in northwest Denver. The rotor sound built outside, intensifying the distinctive thump-thump-thump of a military helicopter on final approach. Not a Black Hawk. Larger. An HH-60M Pave Hawk, the kind used for high-priority transport. The windows rattled. The sound was physics made audible, the sound of weight and authority and consequence coming to land. A 2-star general in dress uniform strode through the entrance 60 seconds later, flanked by 2 armed personnel in battle dress uniform. His rank insignia caught the fluorescent lighting like a blade being drawn. He stopped in front of Brooke, his eyes meeting hers for exactly 2 seconds, that was all it took. Then his right hand came up in a crisp salute, the kind of salute you gave to someone who'd earned it with blood and competence and the kind of decisions that kept other people alive. She returned it. Mercer's face had gone from grey to something that looked like surrender. The administrator stood frozen. The nurses who'd avoided Brooke's eyes all morning now stared at her with the expression of people who'd been wrong about the most fundamental thing in their immediate world. The general turned to face the assembled staff, his presence making the air pressure change, making the hallway feel smaller. Captain Sullivan has been on active duty in this facility as part of a classified investigation. She will be returning to full clinical privileges effective immediately. Any interference with her duties will be considered obstruction of a federal investigation. He paused, his eyes landing on Mercer like a weight being set down. And we'll be discussing your communications with pharmaceutical suppliers. Mercer opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The general turned back to Brooke. 1 sentence, Colonel Hendricks is asking for you. Bay 3. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply walked, her uniform jacket changing into something else as she moved, the security guard becoming the captain, the quiet woman becoming someone who'd spent 3 years holding her shape while the world tried to bend her into something else. The folded flag was still in her car, still waiting, still carrying the weight of Marco Rodriguez and the cost of being quiet in rooms full of people who had absolutely no idea what quiet actually meant. The hallway parted as she moved through it. The general's presence compressed the hallway like an invisible fist closing around everyone's chest. 2-star insignia caught the fluorescent light. Behind him, 3 Pentagon intelligence officers in dark suits moved with the kind of coordinated precision that meant they'd done this before, walked into compromised facilities, identified the problem, and extracted accountability. Mercer's face transitioned in stages that played like a time-lapse collapse. First came the red, the familiar arrogance flush that had served him well for 23 years of unchallenged authority. Then the understanding. Then the grey. A man watching everything he'd built recognize itself as sand. The general turned to Brooke. Not a greeting. A salute. Fist to chest, sharp and clean. She retrieved the medals from her car without ceremony. Silver Star first. Purple Heart. 2 of them. The leather box had stayed in her glove compartment for 3 years, heavier than its weight in grams should have allowed. She pinned them to her scrub jacket with the mechanical precision of someone who'd dressed this way 1,000 times in a different life. Mercer made a sound. Not words yet. The sound of a man's brain processing the incompatibility of the woman he'd belittled with the officer standing in front of him. The general's voice carried like a blade laid flat against steel. Captain Sullivan volunteered for this assignment after losing a team member, Special Operator Marco Rodriguez, in the Hindu Kush. She requested placement here specifically to monitor Colonel Hendricks, who holds intelligence critical to ongoing operations. Mercer's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The Colonel. I didn't realize, if I'd known he was intelligence-related, I never would have. He stopped. The confession incomplete but lethal. The officers exchanged glances. One of them stepped forward. Dr. Mercer. Can we speak privately? It wasn't a question. They moved him to conference room C, the one with the view of the parking lot and the white noise machine that nobody used because nobody wanted to be that obvious. Through the glass walls, nurses watched. The same women who'd stood against the wall during grand rounds, watching him dissect Brooke's chart with theatrical disgust. The same women who'd heard him suggest she'd be more comfortable at an urgent care clinic. The officer closed the door. Brooke didn't hear the words, but she heard the tone. It had the flavor of a man learning he was not, in fact, the apex predator he'd assumed. That there were larger structures operating beneath the institutional hierarchy he'd spent decades navigating. The officers explained about the FBI's hospital fraud task force. 6 weeks of monitoring. Intercepted phone calls from yesterday, the 12 rejections he'd orchestrated, each doctor receiving his warning about a litigious patient, about the liability of taking the colonel's case. They explained about the controlled substance diversion investigation that had flagged Seattle General 3 months prior. When Mercer came out of that room, his hands moved differently. Trembling wasn't the right word. Oscillating. Like something essential had shifted in his center of gravity and he was relearning how to stand. He returned to his office. Closed the door. And made the final miscalculation of his career. The security logs captured everything. Mercer accessing Brooke's nursing records at 1,427 hours. Modifying timestamps. Changing his own documentation from the thoracotomy incident to suggest he'd approved her actions retroactively, that he'd been supervising, that the authorization was his all along. He forged her signature on consultation requests. He modified the colonel's chart to remove evidence that 12 physicians had refused care, making it appear as though a full team had been managing the case. But the FBI task force had been logging every electronic access. Every keystroke. Every deletion. They watched his desperation play out in audit trails and timestamp contradictions that told the story better than any witness ever could. Then they found the other thing. His credentials. Used to approve controlled substances that never reached patients. Diversions he'd authorized through automated systems, likely without knowing he was being used by the defense contractor ring Brooke had been investigating all along. The same network that Marco Rodriguez had died trying to document. The same suppliers whose weapons-grade pharmaceuticals were destined for markets that shouldn't exist. At 1800 hours exactly, 3 FBI agents entered his office. The badge display. The rights recitation. The handcuffs that clicked with the finality of a verdict being read. Mercer's colleagues watched through glass walls as the agents escorted him out. Past the nursing station where Brooke stood. Past the oxygen carts and the medication dispensers and the monitor screens that continued their indifferent beeping, cataloging vital signs of patients who would never know how close they'd come to being sacrificed on the altar of institutional hierarchy. Brooke wore her Air Force dress uniform. The ribbons told a story. The general stood beside her. The medals caught the light. 2 federal agents walked Dr. Mercer out of Seattle General in handcuffs, and the hallway parted like water around a stone sinking. The nurses who had watched his grand rounds performance, who had heard him suggest that vocational nurses didn't understand complex cases, they watched him go. The trajectory was complete. The arc of power reasserting itself under the weight of truth. 6 months later, Brooke stood in the sun at her son's promotion ceremony. First lieutenant now. The rank climbed because merit existed independent of ego. Colonel Hendricks stood beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder. They watched the ceremony conclude, watched the new bars be affixed, watched the young officer shake hands with his commanding officer, the same man whose collapsed lungs she'd manually reinflated with a knife and hands, and the kind of muscle memory that comes from having already saved 7 soldiers on a mountainside when the enemy closed in and the medevac couldn't reach them. Through a chain-link fence at the federal prison in Englewood, Brooke spotted him. Orange jumpsuit now instead of white coat. Mercer was driving a medical supply van across the prison yard, delivering medications under the supervision of guards whose eyes tracked him with a kind of attention he'd never paid to anyone in his life. The sentence included 40 months federal custody, license revocation, and the knowledge that he'd been used by the defense contractors whose greed had cost lives. The folded flag came out of her pocket one last time. Marco Rodriguez's flag. 3 years of wait. 3 years of waiting for the mission to conclude so that the essential act, the burial, could finally happen. She knelt beside the grave. Colonel Hendricks knelt beside her. The flag was folded into the sharp triangle it had always been, and it went into the earth with a Silver Star certificate and a photograph of 7 soldiers, all of them alive because of a woman who'd refused to let hierarchy determine the value of a human life. Rodriguez would be proud, Hendricks said. You did the impossible again. Brooke touched the empty pocket where the flag used to rest, feeling the absence like a pressure release. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. The ceremony concluded with rain that began soft and built to the kind of persistence that feels like applause. She drove past Seattle General one final time on her way to the next assignment. Another hospital. Another cover identity. Another mission where competence without credentials would save lives that hierarchy would have let slip away. The doctors at the next facility would never know they were walking past someone who'd survived the worst and chosen to give everything anyway. The windshield wipers beat their rhythm, and she drove toward the next chapter, carrying nothing but the memory of Marco Rodriguez and the absolute certainty that the quiet person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual value, hit that subscribe button. Like this video. Comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Your stories matter. They remind us all that true power operates underneath institutional titles, in the hands of people who choose competence over ego, every single time.